and welcome back to Dev, the podcast about everyday video game developers and why they do what they do every day. This is Season 2, Episode 3, shifting the format slightly to return to a conversation with someone I know, a good friend, Ed Moore. Ed Moore has been a UX designer, many types of designer, as you'll hear, throughout his illustrious career. Ed and I worked together several times, and I love Ed. He's a good dude. I, of course, appreciate him taking the time to dig into his history with me. As always, the podcast is about uncovering the human side of game development, why developers do what they do every day. It's almost like the clues in the title. And this is one of those conversations for sure. It's great to catch up with Ed, great to have a conversation, great to learn more about him, even though we've been friends for a while. There was still a lot to learn. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I especially enjoy his focus on empathy. I think it's a crucial element to game development that's often forgotten. I think Ed summarizes it very, very well. Please remember, Dev to Dev is on Patreon. The entire of Season 1 is on Patreon, which you can join for a small fee to get access to that if you haven't already caught up with Season 1. Season 2 continues to be free as it rolls out, but there's also video versions of Season 2 available on the Patreon. So a few bonuses if you subscribe, but I hope you enjoy this conversation, so please sit back and listen in. This is Dev to Dev. We know each other well. I consider you a good friend. I'm excited to dig into your history. Obviously, you know, I have known you for a while, so I know some of your history, but the minute, this always happens whenever I start looking at people I know's history, I'm like, I want to know about that. Oh,
snap, you worked there with them?
Well, instantly I'm like, oh, no. So yeah, I always like to start this conversation with my favorite question to kick it off. What first inspired you about video games?
Oh, my goodness. It was probably, I grew up with, my dad was a computer engineer, so we were probably doomed at birth to be surrounded by video games. We had Atari 2600 and we had Atari 800. And so, some of my earliest childhood memories are playing Zork, playing Ultima 2, so text adventures, RPG games. And so I think that, I just always grew up around them. We always had them. We were always going to the video arcades, which used to be a thing. That would be the fun thing to do at the mall, would be just checking out the latest video arcades. And so, so in terms of what inspired me about video games, it was just the idea that there was a world inside the computer that was not your real world, and it had its own internal rules and systems, and that you could explore, and just this sort of, your outer world disappears, and suddenly you're just completely connected to the machine and immersed in the experience. I think that's probably what initially drew me into video games. I mean, I could talk more specific examples, but that would just be kind of the short answer.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think, you said Zork, right? You said that there were probably lots of games in that era that required a lot of imagination to imagine those worlds, but were still very immersive and engrossing and sort of pulled you in a way that almost nothing else could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so arcades, console, PC, sounds like kind of a mixture of platforms. You weren't necessarily a console kid or a PC kid. It was kind of an arcade rat. It was just games, yeah?
Yeah, just games in general. We were really lucky in that regard, so I was born in New Jersey, moved north outside of Boston, and then at some point the 16-bit era arrived, and I was more of a Sega kid than a Nintendo kid, because we had Atari growing up, but after we moved, then Nintendo showed up. And, I loved Sega. I loved Sega games. I loved Outrun, Space Harrier, because they were the peak of the arcade era. They had the most advanced hardware. They had the coolest machines. Everybody was just so enthralled by Sega and their technical mastery. And so when it came time to being okay, video games are back. They went away with the Atari crash and now they're back. And it's do you want, Nintendo or Sega? So it was no choice. It was of course we wanted Sega. So I was one of the weird Sega Master System kids, one of those, So, but I loved it because it was just if I wanted to play Nintendo, I knew about 3 or 4 different kids in the neighborhood. I could go over to their house, and I still played all the Zeldas, the Marios, and other games, But for us, we were definitely a Sega household. My brother also got an Amiga, which he had an Amiga 1000, which was just a revelatory experience growing up with that and just seeing. I always tell people that like it's such a privilege to be able to live in that time, to be able to see how rudimentary and simple games were like before and after the Amiga, and how the Amiga was like this multimedia machine. And you look back on it now and it's just so primitive, but back then it was just like I remember we would go to the mall. We'd go to I lived north of Boston. We would go to the Methuen Mall, and we would go to Dream Machine Arcade. Coincidentally, it's the same arcade that Cliff Blazinski went to because he lived in North Andover. I lived in Andover. So we didn't know each other at all. But we went to the same arcade. And after we went to the arcade, after putting, all the quarters into like Gauntlet and Space Harrier and Outrun or Afterburn or whatever, then we'd go to Walden Software. We'd go to the Walden Books to get some magazines. We'd go to Walden Software. And they would have all the computer games there, and they would have the Amiga, and they were playing Shadow of the Beast on it, and it had that unforgettable intro music with all the parallax scrolling. And it was just like you could go to one part of the mall and have your mind blown in a certain way, and then go to the other part of the mall and have your mind blown in a completely different way. So I was really lucky to have that kind of a childhood, to be exposed to all the different forms of video gaming across the spectrum there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you sort of, a couple of things piqued my interest with that. So one, the technical side of that, right? You talked about parallax in Shadow of the Beast. I remember that too. The power of the Amiga, right? That it was so cutting edge at the time. Like, were you drawn to that generally? Like that idea of being on the cutting edge and kind of playing the latest, greatest?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, because you were just, once you sort of like got to see, because the arcades were always the North Star. They were always like the most advanced custom hardware, and it was always about capturing the arcade experience at home. Again, this is why, being drawn to the Sega Genesis, it was like, hey, we're bringing the arcade experience home. And, so I'd mentioned going to like the Walden bookstore and going like looking at all the magazines, and the magazines of the time, they were always about the latest hardware, that was coming out. So it was always about technology. It was always about like, oh, look, CD-ROMs are coming. Oh my God. Like, we don't have to, deal with beeps and boops for music anymore. We can have full CD audio, so that was always just so captivating for me, to be sort of see the medium grow and to see what types of experiences the new technology could afford. That was just, what I loved so much about it.
Mm. And you mentioned being a Sega kid, not a Nintendo kid, and sort of maybe standing out a little bit as sort of the odd one out. Is that indicative of you as a person? Like, did you enjoy being kind of the odd person out because you were playing Sega, or was it more just because, like you said, Sega was the pinnacle because of the arcade lineage and you just wanted to play those games?
I would say it's more of the latter than the former. Like, because I had such a deep love for Sega and their legacy. But yeah, I mean, I've got a bit of a nonconformist streak as well. Like, I kind of like the idea of finding something unique and rare that not everybody is into, and being able to kind of like plumb the depths of whether that's a movie or book or video game, an experience. There's something about that I enjoy, that I know that I'm deriving enjoyment from something that not everybody does. That's just part of, I guess it just makes me kind of weird. So,
I mean, I'm the same, Ed. There's something about kind of finding the thing that nobody else knows and being able to evangelize
secret gems,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that is a personality trait. And I'm wondering if though, how formative to you as a person, to your childhood, to you growing up, was that, the stuff you talked about being the inspiration for video games, right? The technical side, the cutting edge, the being able to play these crazy, insane arcades like Sega would build, and how did that inform you as a person at that time, or was it just entertainment that was fun?
I mean, my mind immediately goes to a story I like to tell. Is because we were born in New Jersey, and we would go to the Jersey Shore before it was the, GTL Gym Tan Laundry, scene. Like it was like we would go to the boardwalks and we would go, and it was just like arcades. You have no idea. Like it was just like they have amusement park, like little amusement park area, and then they would have like, you get like snacks, food, and then you would go like arcades, and you go in the arcades and they would have like a dozen Double Dragon machines or more. But right in the front, they had the big honking red Outrun pivoting Outrun machine. So Outrun is a game that is super near and dear to my heart. I'm not really a huge racing person, but or driving. Outrun's a driving game, not a racing game. Yeah, I mean, again, that whole idea of the outer world disappearing and being completely immersed in the digital experience. I mean, it's all about that first level in Outrun where you're driving the super red, Ferrari Testarossa, and you got the beach and you got the palm trees whizzing by. I wanted to be in that world. And later in life after college, when an opportunity came for me to come out to California, I mean, I was just like, yes, I want to live in that. I wanted to live in the last wave, like high score screen with like the palm tree silhouettes and the sunsets and, soft music, wafting on the breeze, the passing breeze, one might say, so the passing breeze, so yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was formative to me wanting to come out to California and just, I mean, there was other things too. Growing up, I mean, we watched Star Trek and Star Wars and like the Muppet movie, and it was all about going to California, because we knew that California, Hollywood was where these dreams came from, so the fact that California had both, the movie side of things, all these movie fantasies and worlds that they created there, but also had a very robust video game industry. Like, to me, that was like, yeah, it was absolutely formative and kind of planting those seeds, those wandering seeds of wanting to go and chasing after dreams and life and things of that nature.
Love that. And so that dovetails nicely into the sort of my next question is, at what point did that passion for video games turn into a desire to make them? Was that early or was that late, or when did that come to you?
I mean, that came to me probably in high school. So, I'd mentioned I, grew up on RPGs. Some of my all-time favorites were the original Phantasy Star on the Sega Master System. But at one point, like, again, during the 16-bit era, I branched out. I was able to, I got a job. I was able to afford both Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. And that's kind of when I finally realized, hey, I wasn't just a one system. I mean, we already weren't a one system person. My brother had the Amiga and I had Sega, right? But at that point, I was just like, the thing that pushed me over there was Street Fighter 2. It was just like, it was again, about capturing that arcade experience, bringing it home, and just having such a authentic recreation on a cartridge for Street Fighter 2 was just mind-blowing. And at that point, it was just undeniable. It was just like, yes, absolutely, I have to have a Super Nintendo in addition, So the thing that kind of pushed me over the edge, it was actually probably Final Fantasy 2, which is canonically 4, right? Where I realized that, hey, like, I'd played games that they could tell stories, but in a more primitive way prior to that. But that was like the game that I had played where it was like storytelling was really pushed to the forefront. And the music was just so enthralling. It was just amazing. And it was just like, at that point, I was just like, yes, I want to make games at that point. I want to tell stories within worlds. And how do you make that work? And it would be a long time before I actually realized that. I mean, I was still in high school at that point, but I remember writing a letter I was super into Sierra games as well, Sierra point and click games, because again, they were pushing the envelope in their own ways in terms of storytelling, multimedia. Sierra was a real pioneer with music in games as well, specifically using like the MT32, which was a sound module that you would buy. And it was, again, going back to that Walden software example, we would go see they had an Amiga set up, and we would see Shadow of the Beast on the Amiga. And next to it, they had an IBM computer, and they had the MT32, and they would be running Sierra point and click game demos on it, like Space Quest and King's Quest, and hooked up with the MT32, which had full MIDI music at that time. And just the fidelity and the artistry that they showed there, it was just completely enthralling. They would give out demo tapes on cassette of like, Sierra would put it out of like, hey, here's our games, and they would explain the technology of like, here's the audio for what it sounds like. And, a standard IBM PC was like super rudimentary, right? Literal beeps and boops. And it's like, it could sound like this, or it could sound like da 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 da, bum 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 bum. And it was just like, so I mean, yeah, so I had those tapes, and I just listened to the tapes over and over again. And I really, when I saw like that, how the technology was evolving and people were starting to make games, I actually wrote a letter on a piece of paper, and I put it in a paper envelope and put a stamp on it and put it in a mailbox to a designer by the name of Jane Jensen. She was a famous Sierra designer. She worked on King's Quest, but her claim to fame was the Gabriel Knight series. And I wrote her a letter, and I said, hey, I'm a dorky high school kid in Massachusetts, and I'm going to college, and I want to make games. How do I do that? And this is long before they had like the DigiPens of the world, or they had the guild halls, or the Full Sails, or any of those schools that offered those types of things. And she wrote back to me, and I'm killing myself because I don't know where. Over the years, I've misplaced the letter. I don't know where it is. It's probably disappeared someplace. Yeah, so she actually wrote me a letter, Jane Jensen, and she basically said, I studied computer science, but I also got a minor in English or creative writing or something like that. And that was the template for me. Going into school, I started off in communications, which I in high school, we had a group of friends, and we had a TV studio, and we used to make TV shows. We used to run around in the woods in silly costumes and make like, funny stories just to entertain ourselves, keep ourselves out of trouble. But I actually produced a game show at the height of the 16-bit console war, where it was a review show. I'd review video games. We'd go to the arcade. We'd set up the camera and record footage, and we'd put together our own reviews and stuff like that. And I used to use the music from the Sierra soundtrack, tape as like the intro music for my game show, my game review show. Yeah, I mean, I started off as like going into TV, going into communications, but then I switched over into computer science because I figured, hey, if I can program, that's the hardest job that you can do. And so if I can do that, then that's how I'm going to make games one day.
Right. Okay. So that's a wicked story, kind of inspired by, a luminary of the industry, Jane Jensen, and then that gave you the template for you went to Hofstra University, I think, yeah, and
Hofstra University in New York. Yeah. So yeah, I did computer science. So,
that's cool. And so that gave you the start that you felt like you needed to get into the industry. And then how did you go from doing that to actually being, I think Irrational was your first real job, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I got the computer science degree, and my very first gig was actually on a small PlayStation 1 platformer called Monkey Magic, and it was developed in New York City, believe it or not. There was a small multimedia company there. It was called Music Pen, and they were working with Sunsoft on Monkey Magic is based off of the Journey to the West, the famous Chinese mythological legend. So they were working on, it was almost like a kids show version of that. So that was really my first thing. And to me, it blew my mind. Like, I was like 21 at the time, and it blew my mind that like, oh, I get to go into New York City, 14th Street, Union Square, and work on a PlayStation 1 game. How unique is that, But I was at that job for probably about a year, and then I went to another job as a software engineer that was not in New York City, and that was pretty short-lived. And then I spent that summer out of work, and at that time, this is when like Half-Life the original Half-Life was blowing up. This was, I think it was 1998. So this would have been like, I remember I'd moved into a house with 4 other guys from my fraternity from college. And I remember we had a computer room upstairs, and I would be playing. We were either always playing like StarCraft, or I was playing Thief, or Half-Life, or just all these computer games that were really just this is when the era when the 3D graphics cards were really coming into their own. And I couldn't afford a Voodoo 3D FX, but by the time like I'd gotten out of college and gotten a job, I could get a nice graphics card. And at that point, I had gotten into Half-Life, and Half-Life, of course, was this amazing, mind-blowing, pioneering game experience. But the thing that was cool about it was like they were able to include the Hammer level editing software. So at that point, like, and I was super, again, going back to the magazines, I mean, I had all the Edge magazines. There, what was the American version?
Next Gen.
Next Gen, yeah, I had Next Gen, and they were always interviewing industry luminaries like Warren Spector, and I was always following all the latest, greatest things in the industry. And they were talking about Looking Glass Studios and their pioneering work on the Ultima Underworld series. Of course, there being like a connection with the Ultima series there. And they were making Thief, and I was like following Thief, and how like Thief was also just like a really groundbreaking stealth experience, right? Just pioneering that genre. And then then they came out with System Shock 2. Where they worked with Looking Glass and Irrational Studios had worked together. So at that point, I was just like, I want to work for those people. And so I that summer, I was playing Half-Life, and I was building levels, and I applied for a level builder job. They didn't get back to me at first, so I just kind of took that as a sign of just keep going. I didn't give up, and I spent that whole summer in a hot, non-air conditioned apartment room with multiple computers in the room, just building levels, like playing System Shock 2 late into the night, and then building levels in the Hammer editor. And I sent it off to them, and eventually they said, come on up. And I did the interview. I interviewed with Ken Levine and his team, and I ended up, that was kind of my in. And I got a job at Irrational Games, and this was sort of in their sort of post System Shock 2 pre-BioShock period. But I was super fortunate to work with everybody at Irrational, and also got a chance to see Looking Glass, in its twilight years, and got to know a lot of the super talented people there as well. So that was super. I was super lucky to have that experience as well. It was kind of bittersweet because I had to kind of close the door on my life in New York, and kind of like leave all my friends that I'd been in New York for 6 years, and I had to kind of leave all my friends behind, and I moved back in with my folks, and worked in Boston and with Irrational, so.
Right. So it's so cool. So that sort of Monkey Magic game was your first game development experience. Yeah. Yeah. And then you took the initiative again, like you did with Writing to Sierra, to try and find your way in, and you ended up at what is now considered at the time was beginning to be, and is now considered a very important development team as part in the industry. How did those two transitions feel? Right? How did it feel to kind of go from you did your computer science course, which I'm guessing was relatively general, right? It was relatively general programming. I'm guessing it wasn't particularly video game focused. It was just learn programming.
It was just, we were programming on Unix workstations that had just gotten OpenGL. So this was like really rudimentary PS1 level of graphics in terms of real-time 3D that it could do. So, basic stuff. This was just like, hey, I can make a checkerboard and, programmatically, procedurally, and I can place a cylinder. And I remember I made like this demo of had 3 transparent light cubes, or like one was a sphere, one was a cube, one was a pyramid. See where that's going? But you could just move pieces on the board. I had like a little robot arm and pick it up and put it down. So it wasn't like really like programming games. I mean, we did like AI, like really super rudimentary AI for like little logic and number puzzle games. But really, like my in was as a level builder. So once the tools had advanced, it is kind of like I always saw it as like playing as Lego for adults, like putting environments together, building buildings, doing the texturing, doing the lighting, all of that stuff. It was super enthralling just to kind of take all of these things and put it together, along with like the scripting, placing the objects, defining the behaviors and things like that. So it was sort of like I was always kind of a technical designer because I could program, but it was always programming was always a means to an end, right? It was to be a designer, to be able to craft digital experiences. So yeah.
So yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is sort of why did the design side appeal to you more than the straight engineering side, right? And it sounds like you like you say, engineering kind of felt like it was you were drawn to the creative building rather than the maths and the numbers of the engineering maybe more. Is that kind of?
Yeah, because again, it's always like growing up, it was always who were the people they were interviewing in the computer game magazines. It was always the industry luminaries. They were always like designers, people like Lord British, people like Roberta Williams, people like Jane Jensen, Warren Spector, all of these people. They were technically some of their job titles, they were maybe more producers, but they didn't really, and I know like Richard Garriott, he was a programmer. He used to program, right? But that was never like the forefront of the media that they were putting out. They were talking about their creations. They were talking about the worlds, the stories, the characters. That was always the forefront. And that, to me, I wanted to do that. I wanted to be a designer, a person who is kind of just kind of heading those experiences using programming as a tool versus like, I'm not like Carmack. I'm not like smart enough to be able to program that well, because programming stuff tough, dude. I don't know how much you've done of it, but it's like debugging sucks. You really have to have a lot of patience for it and a lot of persistence and persnicketyness to go through that. And I've done a lot of that too, but it was just, again, it's always been a means to an end, a means of artistic expression, creativity.
Yeah, and I guess it means of building worlds, right? Which is kind of what drew you in the first place, right? That
the whole origin slogan, "We build worlds."
There you go. Okay, so you trained to be a programmer, you learned to be a level designer. Although you had some earlier designer roles, you made a role of being a level designer for 2 years at Irrational. And then you switched to UI. How did that happen? So you moved over to EA, the old EALA, and you moved on, still designer, but also UI. So how did that transition happen? How did you fall in love with making UI?
I kind of fell into that. And that was after, we talked about Outrun and, having California dreams. And eventually I got tired of New England winters, So I moved out here without a job. I had one thing a lot of people may not know about me is that I also studied to be a bartender because I figured no matter where you go, people like to drink. So I figured like if I can make drinks, I can make money no matter where I go. So that was always like the backup thing. So I used to work for like catering companies when I moved out here, until I got a job. But I had worked at that point. I had worked with Irrational for a number of years on some unpublished things. I had, I had worked with Hammer. I had worked with LithTech. I'd worked with Unreal. I think we were up to Unreal 2 at that point. So I had a computer science degree, so I could program, right? So I came out here, and I remember I went to it was some sort of game dev meetup or a talk at UCLA. And I remember meeting people from EA LA there, and they were looking for level builders on the Medal of Honor series. So that was kind of like my sort of dump everything and go out to Hollywood moment, right? Where fate stepped in and just, here's your opportunity. So that's how I got involved with the Medal of Honor series. And I worked on Medal of Honor expansion packs for Allied Assault. So this would be around the 2002 period of time. So I worked on Spearhead, I worked on Breakthrough. And then how I got into UI was we were developing Medal of Honor Pacific Assault. And I was the lead multiplayer designer on that project on the EA side, and we had outsourced the majority of the development to a studio up in Santa Cruz called TKO Software. And so we used to have weekly calls with them. They used to send me up at like 5 a.m. on the little shuttle flight up to San Jose, and I would drive down the 17 down to Santa Cruz. But usually it was probably about once a month they would send me up there. So we worked with them on both Breakthrough and on Pacific Assault multiplayer. And so we didn't really have a UI UX designer wasn't really a thing in the games industry at that time. They had UI artists, of course, right? But I was the game designer of like a lot of the high level modes and the mechanics and the classes and things like that. We were really heavily kind of like basing the game mode off. I don't know if you remember Wolfenstein Enemy Territory back in the day. I don't know if you ever played much of that, but that was kind of like, if people can imagine a class-based multiplayer like that. And so we didn't have a UI designer on the project, so somebody had to design all the lobbies and the menus and the matchmaking screens and the loadout screens and the scoreboards and all of that stuff. So I had probably a 150 to 200 page GDD just for multiplayer. And a lot of that was just what were wireframes. At that point, I don't know if it was in Microsoft Word or Word Perfect, right? But I would just make like little vector diagrams of like, hey, this is what the landing page loadout is, and this image goes here, and these buttons go here, and this is the text that goes here. And if you do this or that, this is all the edge cases and stuff like that. Looking back, I mean, it was a terrible interface design. It was super wordy. In case you can't tell, I'm a super verbose kind of guy. But it got my start, and that because of that experience, after Pacific Assault wrapped up, I got the opportunity to work with the Lord of the Rings RTS team, and it was primarily my work on the Medal of Honor Pacific Assault UI that they were like, okay, we need that. We need somebody to come in, because they had just made Battle for Middle-earth 1, and there were all these new community features that they were implementing for the next game, incremental features. So it was like they needed somebody to design that. So that's how I kind of fell into it. I didn't quite understand it at first, because it was sort of like it wasn't something that I had, growing up, like, oh, I want to make interfaces in games. But it was just the opportunities were there, and people were just kind of, eventually it kind of got in my blood, and people gravitated towards me because of that experience. Because at that time, it was still kind of like a very specialized or niche field for games. It was almost kind of like a afterthought in terms of like, okay, oh dang, we've got to make the UI. Somebody's got to do it. How about that guy? So.
Right, so you wrote a giant GDD, a giant game design document to kind of presumably walk through the whole interface, and that as a result, I mean, clearly you had even though you might have been the only person doing it, you obviously had a flair for it. I guess it worked, and it drew people to you. Like you say, it wasn't something you thought you would do, but is there something in you that kind of made you good at that, do you think? Was there some attention to detail, or some, the way your mind works that kind of allowed you to kind of break down? Because a lot of UI work is about breaking down screens and structures, and like you say, what leads to what, right? It's very almost flowchart-esque, right? When you kind of build big UIs. So was there something about your brain process, or you thought that drew you to that? Or do you just genuinely feel it was like, I was the only guy that did it, and I guess I did it okay?
I mean, that's a great question. I remember taking one of those, I don't know if it was like a personality test or like some sort of an IQ test or something like that, but it told, like, I remember doing this online, and it said that, like, your personality profile or type matches a visual philosopher. So I was always, like, just kind of very much, like, into graphics. Like I said, we had an Amiga growing up, and I had Deluxe Paint. I used to do animations for, like, the TV shows I used to make and stuff like that. So I was always, like, really enthralled with graphics. So for me, like, I guess I was always kind of some sort of visual thinker. And so being able to kind of, like, not only just lay out how something should appear on the screen, but how it changes over time. So, like, how do you connect, the different, this is where we're getting into the UX thing, but if, like, you have a flow and you have the user has a goal at the end of that to accomplish a certain thing, like you may want to configure your character loadout a certain way. You may want to filter for a certain type of online match that you want to play, do a certain progression system choice, upgrading type thing. You have a goal at the end of it, the thing that you want, and along the way you have different tasks. So how do you take that goal and break it up into different steps, understanding the underlying game systems and the underlying technology to present it in a way that is just as frictionless and as delightful as possible for players. So I don't know. I guess I just I liked working with some of the tools, like working with things like Visio, because I'm from between, like, Medal of Honor, Pacific Assault, and Lord of the Rings. Like I mentioned, I started in, like, WordPerfect or Word, I don't even remember, but started using Visio in Battle for Middle-earth. And that was just a lot more conducive to creating an architecture, creating those flowcharts that connected all the screens and all the flows together. And that's where I really think it transitioned from being, like, something I had to do to something that I enjoyed because of the strategic value that it provided. You get a seat at the table of every single part, every single screen in the game. Every part, every feature, you have it all in your blueprint, all in front of you, and you get to contribute to how does that get surfaced? How do we connect all the dots together? There was something that was to have that sort of strategic seat at the table and talk to everybody on the team. I enjoyed being that sort of that glue that, because designers are always the integrators, right? We're the glue that we take all the media that everybody else makes. We take, the models that the character guys do, or the character people, the textures that the artists do, the sound, the all the features that the engineers are making. We put it together and we craft the moment to moment experiences. So, that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And I think for me, in many ways, it echoes, you found a niche that was less understood and you could own and evangelize, almost like the Sega Master System. Like, it almost feels like a mirror image of that, right? That, you found that thing that you could own. And
hadn't really thought about it that way, but it tracks.
Maybe I'm it's a reach there, but I think it's interesting.
You're reading. You know what you're doing? You're doing, like, Gestalt theory. You're taking limited information and you're filling in the blanks. Human brains do it. We can't help it. So you're just crafting a story so it makes sense to you. Sega Master System UI design. So
there you go. They are one and the same. I think what it is it's sort of trying to get to that root of, like, why you, Ed Moore, are the person that could take this journey and end up where you've ended up, right? And I think that is invariably a culmination of your experiences and your passions and your focus and the things you're good at and not so good at, right, throughout that time. So I think that's kind of what I love from these conversations, is kind of digging into that. So I want to jump ahead a little bit, just because you took a break effectively away from UI, right, and design into this sort of development manager / designer role at Pandemic, but then you went back to UX and UI at Spark and Big Red Button. So why did you? Was it just not? Why did you leave to do a different role, and then why did you go back to UI UX after that?
So, I was at EA for about, let's see, it would be like 2002 to 2006. So it was 4 years. And I had been a single player design lead on Breakthrough, multiplayer design lead on Medal of Honor Pacific Assault. And then when I transferred over to the RTS team, they were a great team, great people. But I was in in addition to doing UI design, I was also doing mission design for RTS games. And I had loved StarCraft, but I mean, at that point, I was like, been making levels and content in first-person shooter engines. So it was kind of a move that I didn't quite understand. Like, why was I not still a lead, right? And it was a very important lesson early on because a lot of times our career trajectories are not linear. They have twists and turns. They go up and down, right? And I had wanted to continue being lead. I'd wanted to continue to have that sort of like strategic experience, being able to contribute to the team. And so there was after I had sort of had an opportunity, I was told I would have an opportunity to go back to Medal of Honor and do that on Medal of Honor Airborne, but to lead up a pod or, like a cross-disciplinary group. But that didn't really materialize. So at that point, I was kind of ready for a change. And so an opportunity opened up at Pandemic to go work as a lead level designer over there on a project that ultimately got canceled. But at that point, it was like, yeah, I'm going to go over to Pandemic. And at that point, I hadn't really like sort of fully like embraced UI UX design at that point. It was something I was doing. It was something I was practicing, but I didn't sort of feel like that was really like I didn't really kind of own that, I feel like, until I went to Spark and worked on Lost Planet, right? I sort of felt like it was still kind of a fluke at that point, or just a weird twist. So me going over to Pandemic, I ended up on the Mercenaries team. I worked on Mercenaries 2 on they had like it was an open world game. So they had a whole bunch of side missions. They needed Lua scripting. So again, kind of bringing that sort of like computer science experience to bear, just laying out a lot of side missions and doing the Lua scripting to hook it all up. Later, I had an opportunity to do some DLC missions for Mercenaries 2. And then, Mercenaries 3 came around, which was also a canceled project, but we were in pre-pro for that. And there was a lot of turnover after Mercenaries 2. That was a challenging project for Pandemic Studios. Pandemic was a little late to the at that point. This is the HD gen, so this would be Xbox 360, PlayStation 3. They had a lot of turnover, and they kind of like had to sort of reform the Mercenaries team. And they, at the end of every project, there's always a postmortem. There's always things that went well and things that didn't went well. And I was really impressed by how they had turned things around at EA with from Battle for Middle-earth 1 to 2. I felt that they had great process, a great team culture. And so I remember at that time, because remember, Pandemic had been bought out by EA, right? Remember they had BioWare Pandemic, Elevation Partners, and that was headed by Uncle JR, John Riccatello. And, he basically put those two studios together, BioWare and Pandemic, and then he sold them back to EA, and then he got his job back at EA, right? So EA had bought out Pandemic, and so we were able to have like openly approaching, hey, I'm going to go talk to the people I used to work with at EA on the RTS team. And I remember like talking to my old boss and being like, hey, like I'm over at Pandemic. They need help in production with Mercenaries 3. At that point, I had kind of gotten very interested in production process, development process. How do you create good team cultures? And I remember having a lot of dialogue back and forth between my former teammates and my current ones. So that's kind of how I became a development manager. I remember even at one point, my old boss, Wes Eckhart, he from the RTS team, he came up to Pandemic Studios. We went out to lunch, and I had him talking to my producer on Mercenaries 3. So we just kind of wanted to be like, hey, how do we create a culture of continuous improvement so that we can create this environment that's conducive for game makers to be creative and to do their best work. And that's really what I wanted to try to capture. But, all good things come to an end. And I went through the pandemic shutdown in 2009. And then in terms of so that's kind of how I went into, develop, out of UX, UI, and how I got back into it was my old friend, Matt Sophos. He and I started at EALA on Medal of Honor at the same time, the same day. And so he was the creative director at Spark Unlimited, and they were working with Capcom. This is at the time when Capcom was courting a lot of Western developers for, some of their, B-tier franchises, things like Lost Planet, things like Devil May Cry. So there might have been one other game that they had gotten. I don't remember, but we were trying to get Lost Planet 3. So, and they're like, well, Ed, we worked together at EA. You did a lot of UI work. You did a lot of multiplayer work. Why don't you come over here and do that at Spark? So I kind of had this sort of hybrid role as like the lead multiplayer designer and the lead UX designer on Lost Planet. So that's kind of roughly how I kind of went out of it and came back into it. It was sort of just like, whatever role or opportunity presented itself at that time, that's kind of what I sort of adapted myself to.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And that sort of has led to UI and UX being a passion for you since then, from Spark to Big Red Button, back to EA, where we worked together at Dice Soleil. And then also your own independent, freelance kind of work as well. Talk to me about that. Like, why and how did freelance become something that you wanted to, do and turn your hand to, and what is it that you enjoy about that side of the business?
Yeah, I mean, the freelancing thing came about because we had shipped Lost Planet 3. We did a lot of good work on that project, but the Metacritic didn't quite reflect that. And so that was like a 53. I had an opportunity to work with Big Red Button that was founded by some ex-Naughty Dog people. So, of course, Naughty Dog has like sort of to work with people from there that had sort of an allure to it. But they were working with Sega. So that was sort of like childhood dream wish fulfillment there. But the game we were working on was Sonic Boom. And I was really only there for about a year. Sonic Boom shipped on Wii U on the Crytek engine. So, it didn't quite add up to Metacritic success either. We were working on Sonic Boom and the Metacritic didn't quite line up there either. So I kind of figured that, at that time, this is when VR started to take off here in LA. And there was just a lot of things going on with startup culture here in LA. This was when the whole Silicon Beach thing was happening. And at that point in time, I'd really kind of accepted the fact that, hey, UX is kind of my niche. This is where I'm planting my flag. And so I wanted to see if I could try to, could I take what I had learned and apply it to broader industries, right? And I had kind of assumed that transition would be quite easy. But, what I kind of realized was that when I was going out, on going to meetups, networking events, trying to make connections with people in the Silicon Beach scene, I was going up against UX designers that had been designing, websites and apps for decades, right? So I found that I thought I was a special snowflake, and I had found that I was really like a little fish in a much bigger pond, right? So my time kind of as a freelancer was really characterized by a mix of being able to, there were some non-game projects and non-game clients that I was able to court. I was able to leverage my experience as a user experience practitioner into like working on smaller scale projects, right? But a lot of my experience was really like people in my network were here in LA. They were doing VR startups. They were doing VR projects, and again, kind of always being sort of like trying to keep my finger on the pulse of all the whatever technology is new or up and coming. Yeah, my mind kind of gravitated towards that, and so really, like, yeah, that was what a lot of my work as a freelancer was working on. I'd worked on a game called World War Tunes, which was like a multiplayer, sort of like just like a team deathmatch, like kind of goofy. Imagine like if you took Medal of Honor and you put like Looney Tunes in a blender. That's really what it was like. But the another game that I worked on was a PlayStation VR game published by Sony called Starblood Arena. It was developed by a studio called White Moon Dreams, and there were some ex-EA people that were over there as well. Basically, that was kind of like I think it was like a 3v3, if you could imagine Descent Free Space, not Descent Free Space, but Descent in like a 3v3 multiplayer type setting, 360-degree shooter and stuff like that. So I got a chance to work on those games. So as well as a bunch of smaller narrative VR experiences for a bunch of startups. So it was really like a time of really like a scary time, because it was like I was freelancing. I wasn't an employee. I was a consultant, but I had learned so much during that time. One of my first clients was a marketing agency, not game dev people. It was mostly a female run business. So we were working with companies like Staples and Kaiser Permanente, nothing to do with games, but I also had a chance, because I had some work experience as a systems designer. I also kind of tried to position myself as a gamification specialist, so I could help people design progression systems and how to gamify their apps so that they'd be more sticky. So that was also kind of a way that I was sort of able to kind of try to leverage my experience from games into a non-game context.
Huh. It makes sense, yes. Like you say, sort of taking the best of what you've learned and kind of offering that as a way of helping other people make their stuff better. And you mentioned kind of planting your flag in UX and that being your thing. Like, why? Ed Moore, are you a UX designer? What is it about it that you think that draws you? And what do you think, as based on who you are, what do you think you bring to that role?
So I love that question, because it goes back to one of my favorite books called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. He has a great TED Talk about that. It just goes to root causes. How do you connect people, to motivate people? And when you can align on the why, that's how you can really motivate people. So for me, my why is that it goes back again to Lost Planet and Sonic Boom. They were like a 50-something Metacritic and a 30-something Metacritic respectively. Whereas like if you look at like Battle for Middle Earth 2, that was like an 84 Metacritic. So, using your Gestalt, fill in the blanks kind of brain, what would you, I toss that question back to you, Mr. Alex Nolan. What would you assume about user research or user-centered practices on those three projects?
I'm guessing that Battle for Middle Earth embraced, absorbing as much information from external sources to make it better, and Sonic and Lost Planet didn't.
Not to the same extent. So, I mean, Battle for Middle Earth was, they had a community manager. They were actively collecting feedback from the community. Because remember, this team, they had made Command & Conquer Generals and a whole slew of probably Command & Conquer games before that. And so them taking that leap from Command & Conquer to Lord of the Rings, because this was, Y2K era, Lord of the Rings trilogy, huge, right? So this was a big deal to kind of like make that leap. So with the first game, they had made kind of some choices that had really kind of tried to court a more mainstream audience who was more streamlined, and that didn't really connect with the core audience so well. So they had a community manager, and the community manager was really collecting feedback about how do we make this game better? How do we make this experience back to kind of what core RTS fans want. In addition to that, later on in development, they had we had focus tests. We had people come in and we were able to see like behind glass, people playing the game, and they had moderated discussions. And like I think you remember when we worked together at DICE, I kind of did something similar with one of the projects we worked on, and like being able to like the power of being able to set up that moment where people see their work, developers see their work being played by someone who is not them. Suddenly all the light bulbs go on over their heads, and they realize it just happens. It's magic, right? So anyway, so my why was just like, when I very much believe that like you need, I look at UX like an insurance policy. Like you need to have feedback loops in place because we lose our objectivity from our work. We work on it day after day, year after year. We are too close to our work. We lose our capacity to see things through a first-time user perspective. So we need those practices and feedback loops in place so that we can make something that actually connects to player emotions and fulfills player expectations. Because if you're going to dedicate multiple, years of your life and millions of dollars to making a game for it only to come out as like a 50-something, 30-something Metacritic, right? Not really worth it, right? So for me, that is kind of my why. That's like the cause of user centricity is important to me because, I've seen both ends of the spectrum where you have, good user-centered practices and as well as situations where not to the same extent. And maybe things could be different if you embrace leveraged UX or UX research in a different way.
That makes sense. And so that desire to kind of, like you say, help people see the truth of what they're making and, and improve it. Does that show up anywhere in your day-to-day life, Ed, or is that very sort of isolated to your career?
Wow. Am I improver outside of...
I mean, the passion that you get from, you mentioned kind of seeing people see their work. You can separate that emotion and that joy that you get from the game side, the game development side, right? That inspires you, right? There is a passion there to help people be better, help their work be better, help them excel, right? Do you think that's something that is you, or is that you Ed the human, or you Ed the developer? Like, is there overlap there?
Yeah, I have two kids and I'm helping teach my daughter piano, so I grew up playing, we had synthesizers around the house and we had a Hammond organ, and I played organ for 8 years. And now my daughter is 8. So I'm helping teach her. But yeah, I get a great deal of satisfaction when, I guess this is still more work-centered than life-centered, right? But I get a great deal of satisfaction when, like, I see somebody owning a problem in a way that when I delegate something to somebody and they can make something, bring their own creativity, pour their own creativity into it, and they can come up with a solution that's better than what I could come up with or different than what I came up with, but in a good way. Like, to me, that indicates that somebody is really owning a problem or an ask. And I think kind of going back to kind of creating cultures of continuous improvement and creating healthy team cultures is like one of the things I strive to do is kind of define like the what, not the how. And I learned that from my time at Pandemic. They used to have like management training courses and things like that. And that was kind of one of the things we learned about this metaphor called the funnel, whereas like when you're delegating something to somebody, like think about like a funnel, and you have the outcome, and then you have the size of the funnel, right? The top, right? The mouth of the funnel. And so you have to kind of size the funnel to the individual person's capacity. So, and if you have somebody who's really gifted, who's really talented, really invested in their work, you can give them a really big funnel, let them go, give them a long leash, and let them come back with stuff that you can tell that they really own the work that they're doing. Sometimes that doesn't work for all people, and so you have to sometimes be more, try to make the funnel smaller, specify the ask, but try to do it in a way so that you're hopefully not micromanaging. And that's like a very precarious balance to try to strike, So, yeah.
Yeah. And this is a deep question. Do you feel like being a game developer has made you a better person?
Ah, gosh. I would like to think that through our work as game developers, we're able to bring joy to people, right? Like the things that, inspired us. That's what it's always really been about. Going back to whys again, is like, why do you do what you do? And I always loved it when I was growing up. I'd be playing games and I'd be enthralled with them, and I'd learn about the personalities behind the games. And so it always comes back to like a desire to recapture that and to pass that on to somebody else. So I do think that through my work as a UX person, has exposed me to accessibility and psychology, and has helped me to kind of understand human nature, human biases, both in myself and in others. And so it kind of helps provide frameworks for how do you navigate differences of opinion? How do you navigate challenges? How can you sort of look at yourself objectively when you know that you're reacting from an instinctual place rather than from a mindful place, right? So, in particular, like working with making games accessible. I mean, that's just something that like when you make games accessible, you're improving UX for everybody, right? I very much believe that, and I think that to me, that's also a cause that I feel very, very is dear to me, because it's a way of giving back and making sure that everybody can enjoy the games, can get joy from the games that you're creating. So there's a lot to feel good about that. So I would like to think that like those things hopefully have made me a different person. Hopefully objectively better, but maybe subjectively better. I don't know. So do you think I'm a better person?
I mean, I think you're an awesome person, Ed. So, I mean, I would say that the way that you show up in the world reflects who you are, the role you have, right? Because I think, and I think this personally about myself as well, as a designer, maybe not all designers, and certainly not only designers, but I feel like designers, there's an element of psychology that is involved in your work, right? You're trying to understand play patterns, play style, player behavior, and like it's hard for that not to bleed back into your reflection on your kids, on your friends, on other people in the world, other humans. And I think those always blur. I think when you get a bit older, I think maybe when I was younger, I was like, I didn't care. But I think as I get older, I think you start to see it's hard not to have that. The way you see the player impact the way you see other humans in general,
Well, it really comes down to empathy, doesn't it?
Yes. Great point.
Like just having empathy like that, like there is no UX without a user, right? And so being able to stop thinking about yourself and what you want, Alex Sulman, as a game designer, and what it is that the player wants, or what the player is expecting, what the player needs, that requires a great deal of empathy. And so I think that connects you to empathy, connects you to your users, to your players. It connects you to people in your family, your community. So I think that's been a huge takeaway for me in this sort of UX journey is how do I be a more empathic person? And I hope with age and time that I've kind of stopped reacting to things instinctually and hopefully have learned to be a better listener and a better communicator through the cause of empathy, because I do, try to think about how my words are perceived. I don't always do a good job of it, right? But I do try. I'd like to think that most of my interactions with people around me are beneficial ones because I'm leveraging empathy.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to wrap this up, Ed. I think that's a brilliant closing thought, and I very much agree. So yeah, thanks for taking the time. It's great to to dig into your history a little bit and hear how you as a person have gone through this journey and how you show up as a developer. So yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, just it's a ton of gratitude, and it's always a pleasure to connect and talk shop. I'd love to do it again sometime. Let me know. So I'm sure we'll see you soon.
Can't wait.
Can't wait. Okay, chap. Always a pleasure. Lovely to see you.
Always a pleasure. Never a chore.
Never a chore. Never. All right. Be well, my friend. Thank you again.